Welcome to another broadcast from mindyourhealthcast.com. As you probably noticed, I'm starting out with my rose-colored glasses on because for a change, instead of critiquing some of the things that have been happening as far as health and medicine and etc., we are going to talk about some positive things because I have a positive side also. Now, the subject I've chosen for today is kind of really one of the things that I have enjoyed over the years and have continued to follow. It kind of grew at one time and then subsided for a period of time. And now it appears that the time is right for it to emerge with all the new things that have been discovered and researched over the years that can be useful to the subject we're going to talk about. Now, of course, as with all new subjects to certain people, in other words, it may not be new, but it might be new to you. Sometimes people look at it askance, and they may even think, sounds a little quacky to me. But at any rate, get all these glasses off, and we'll dig into the subject. And the subject for today is called Personal Growth, the Movement. Now, personal growth as a semi-organized approach to helping people make change began many years ago. And looking back, it seems that after the Great Depression and after World War II, there was relief that everything was kind of settling down and times were better financially and there were jobs and a lot of good things happening. And so people kind of just fell into grooves of certain type and continued to live out that groove until they died. In other words, they didn't get real excited about progressing or improving themselves. They just were willing to accept what was and to go with it. There were a couple of exceptions, of course. There was a group that had developed called the New Thought group, and these were people who realized that mankind had lots of potential and that in many cases was not utilizing that potential. And so there were several writers that came along who discovered certain things about human nature and human potential. And so basically that's what we're talking about, is really the human potential movement. In other words, discovering or uncovering what potential we have and developing in that to its highest level. And another term that was kind of used was called self-actualization, which meant to, again, bring yourself up to your capabilities and get in life where you would really like to go. A lot of people, as I mentioned, after the Great Depression and World War II, had figured that anything that was kind of settled and that you could make a living at was pretty good compared to where things had been. So they didn't have a lot of motivation, but there were people in the background, and had been actually from the late 1800s into the early 1900s. And as I say, it was called the New Thought movement, and these were people that were looking to not where man was, but where man could become. And they spent a lot of time learning about the potential that we have and our capabilities and how to fine-tune those and move us on forward. Now, there was also Napoleon Hill, and many will probably remember, if nothing else, his best-selling book, which was probably and maybe still is one of the best-selling books in the world, called Think and Grow Rich. And that came out of his research and study. Anybody who has known or read anything about Napoleon Hill realized that he came from a poor family up in Virginia, and his father was a coal miner, but his mother died when he was about 9, and his father remarried, and the lady that the father married actually was a a very educated lady, had gone to college, which of course the father had not. He was a coal miner, and that he was content to make his living mining coal. But anyhow, she saw potential in him, married him, and also Napoleon and his brother, she worked on helping them to develop and get to someplace better in life than they grew up with. And in fact, Napoleon, if you listen to his story, he tells about the fact that when he was a young boy in Hungary, he used to sit down in a certain area and imagine that he was very full, food-wise, and was riding this big steam-driven iron horse along through this area that he used to sit and contemplate. As it ended up, his mother, stepmother, recognized in him a lot of potential, and so he got an opportunity years later. He did get through basic college, was planning to go to law school like his brother, which did go to law school, but he ended up that he was looking for something more, I think, or at least he was ready for it, whether he knew it or not. And that door opened when, writing some articles for a magazine, he was sent to interview Andrew Carnegie, the steel producer, and at that time, one of the wealthiest men in the world, if not the wealthiest. And when he went to interview him, it ended up that at the end of the interview, Andrew Carnegie evidently saw something in Napoleon Hill and made a challenge. And his challenge was that I will not pay your way and I won't pay your expenses, but I will give you letters of introduction to the most successful people in this country. And your job will be to go and interview and study those people and figure out what the core secret is of their success. And so he himself says that when Carnegie gave him this challenge, in his mind about a dozen things or more popped up why he was not the person to do that. He had a poor background. He didn't feel as communicative as he could be. Bottom line, he had poor self-confidence that he could actually go and meet with all these people. But another part of him said, yes, I will. And he said, not only will I take this on, but I will complete it. And Carnegie, from that point on, they actually became very good friends. Carnegie gave him the letters of introduction. He traveled around the country and interviewed, I'm guessing, as high as 500 people that had become extremely successful at one point, and many of them had been successful and ended up nosediving at some point along the way. In other words, they didn't keep it. And so out of that, he assembled a philosophy, and he published those early and around the 1920s, and it was called The Law of Success. It was actually a large set of volumes of what he had learned that was common between all the people that succeeded well. And as a part of his philosophy, if you really look into it, and I've looked into it, I think I've read every book that he wrote, and all the way back from The Law of Success, and Think and Grow Rich came many years later, as a result of his applying this and teaching it to a lot of people. He came out with this popular book, which, as I say, became a bestseller. In fact, it was so popular that Gandhi from India read it, and he wondered if Napoleon Hill was for real. He made a trip to the U.S. to meet Napoleon Hill, and then was convinced that he was what he proposed in the book, and so he ordered it translated into various languages in India for the people there because he thought it was such a good book. Anyhow, that was someone who realized if you're going to succeed or you're ever going to have what you would really like to have in life, you have to make changes. And his philosophy is about making those changes and adding to your repertoire of knowledge and behavior those things that equip you to be what you could be. In other words, not what you're doing right now, but what you could be and what you were. And so that's why, it was referred to as the human potential or human growth or self-actualization concept. And his material is still good today. I think I've listened to his last live lectures in 1954 in Chicago. And from his material, I have that set of recordings, and I've probably listened to those maybe 25 to 30 times already, maybe more. But many, many times, and I still continue to listen to them because the material there is very timely. So at any rate, that was something as far as the foundation, because later when this movement developed in this country, that was a lot of the material that was utilized were the things that Napoleon Hill taught. There had been other writers, and he claims that what he had was nothing new, but he was the first person that assembled it all together into a working system, and that it did work because the people who followed his approach did very well if they applied it. But there were other people. James Allen from Great Britain wrote a book called As a Man Thinketh. There was a pile of them. William Waddles wrote material on your right to be rich, your right to succeed, and et cetera, et cetera. So there was material coming out, but it really wasn't organized, and it really wasn't, there wasn't a place you could go and go through a program that incorporated all this. So what I'm getting at, that this was the beginning of a more organized approach and places where people could go to learn how to become what they would like to become. So many people, as I say, just kind of settled in, and whatever job came along, they took it. May not like it, but it was a job. And so many people after the Depression and World War II were so happy to have any kind of a job and some stability that it didn't enter their mind that maybe they could really improve themselves to the point that they could experience their dreams. So you can see why this is kind of interesting to me. There were several people, and we're going to talk about it, that laid the foundation for this movement that began, I would say, in the early 50s, 1950s, and with that, the opening of several centers, and there was what they were called at the time were growth centers. And I remember when all this happened. And I had, in my 20s, become interested in all this, which would have been in around the 1950s. And it was exciting to me to, for some reason, I always had the feeling that there was a lot more out in the world that I was not aware of, and a lot more things that I could be able to do if given the right information or opportunity. And so it appealed to me, and I started reading. I read a lot of the old books. I read all Napoleon Hill's material and some of the others, and then I found out that they had opened these growth centers. There was one in California near San Francisco in the Big Sur area called Esalen Institute. There was one in Chicago called Oasis. I think there were a couple in New York, and probably 2 or 3 other large cities around the country. And each of them kind of picked an interesting name. Esalen Institute, I think, probably was the biggest. I ended up never getting there, but I did go to Chicago to Oasis. And the situation of these centers were that they brought in people who were experts in various areas of personal development. And they also had ongoing workshops lectures, training programs, materials that were available, books, recordings, and so forth, so that you could go there and you paid a small fee to become a member, and then you had a discounted access to all these programs. Now, anyone could come to the program, but there was a price for non-members and a special price for members. And I was in northern Ohio at the time, so I had to travel from Cleveland to Chicago to go to Oasis, but I thought it was a very good center, and I met some very interesting people who, some are still around. One was Beryl Payne, was one of the gentlemen conducting a program there on biofeedback. Now, we're going to talk about biofeedback in a few minutes, and he, at that time, was very heavily into biofeedback, and he did some programs for them, and he has continued over the years. He's a PhD psychologist. He was out of Boston area, and one of his books way back then, when the drug culture was developing pretty heavily, wrote a book called Getting There Without Drugs. In other words, how can you improve yourself and get to a higher level of thinking and awareness and so forth without taking drugs. And there were a lot of methods, one of which was biofeedback. And later in his life, he has gotten very heavily into magnetic fields and electromagnetic healing and development and fixed permanent magnet fields and so forth. And he's written several books about it, and he still is active and trains in it. And I enjoyed meeting him, and I've enjoyed keeping up with him over the years. But anyhow, he was kind of a part of that movement because of the biofeedback side of it at the time. Those continued to grow, and as I say, people would many times go and stay there for a week in the area if they were from out of town, or even 2 weeks, and go through a lot of different programs that were going on, because there were ongoing programs, both daytime, weekends, and evenings, and pretty much 7 days a week there was something happening that you could go and take advantage of. The problem, of course, ended up is, like everything else, there developed a kind of a cult out of it, and when I say a cult, it became the end thing to do. In other words, a lot of celebrities and movie stars got involved, and Psychology Today had a cartoon of a big gorilla with a suitcase, and of course they don't do it so much anymore, but there was a time when people who traveled a lot wanted people to know they traveled a lot, so they would get these stickers from the different countries and stick on their luggage. And so the more stickers you had on your luggage, the more traveled you were, and that was a status symbol. And so that was, I think, one of the things really that became part of the downfall of the movement, was that people began to look on it as a in thing or faddish thing to do. And here, it was something you could talk about in a social group. Well, I just came back from 3 weeks at Esalen Institute in Big Sur, California, and that would mean people would say, wow, you spent 3 weeks at Esalen Institute? Now, whether or not the person really derived any benefit out of that was beside the point. So it became quite interesting, and I watched it, as I say, it grew and it peaked, and then at the same time I watched it as it began to disintegrate. Because of the fact it became so faddish that it didn't mean it much anymore. And people went only because of the status, not because they really made change in their lives. In fact, most of those people that went only for a faddish deal, unless something there caught their real attention, that's what they ended up. They ended up, it was just another notch in their gun handle, so to speak, and they really didn't make any change. Now, it's interesting to look back at some of the pioneers that developed principles that all of this was built on. Now, it sounds, the way I'm presenting it maybe, that it was kind of hodgepodge, but it really wasn't. There were a lot of basic researched out principles that were brought into this, and different centers maybe put it together in a slightly different way, but they still utilize material and information from some very brilliant researchers and also clinicians. There were a lot of clinicians, like one of the biggies, if you've never read any of his material, would be good to get into, is the works of Carl Gustav Jung out of Switzerland. He was became known as an analytical psychologist. He was a protege of Sigmund Freud. Now, pretty much everybody is aware of Sigmund Freud. He made a big impact. He actually was significant in getting mental illness on a better footing in terms of recognition of what it was and the therapy, because up to the time of Freud, if you were behaving bizarrely, the diagnosis by medicine of the day was brain fever, and their outlook was incurable. So you just take that person and you chain them up in a big center that was kind of like a prison, and you give them some food to keep them alive and kind of maintain them, but it would be a waste of time to try to do any therapy because their brain was destroyed by brain fever. And Freud came along and said, no, that's not really what's going on. These people have a lot of unconscious issues that have created them trouble, early life conflicts, traumas, etc., etc. And so Freud is the one that got pulled into and became a part of mainstream medicine eventually, after he proved them totally wrong in the fact that it wasn't brain fever, but it was some parts of the mind that they didn't know about and didn't understand. Now, people take for granted a lot of things today about the brain-mind and about mental illness, as it's termed, which basically are problems of adjustment and problems of early emotional trauma that people have difficulty getting away from. But most people are aware of all this today and kind of take it for granted. But in Freud's time, he became a real pioneer. And his whole approach eventually, and he was really not into it to be a clinician. He was a researcher, but it ended up that he, in his research, got into developing something called psychoanalysis, which became known as the analytic school of psychiatry. And so the psychiatrists kind of adopted Freud into their ranks and his writings and teachings. And so there still today is a type of psychiatry called psychoanalysis. And his theory was eventually, what he solidified into was, if you can uncover what these early life things are that are a problem and these conflicts you have internally, and become aware of them, you can get well. Well, in theory it sounded pretty good, but in practice it's never worked quite so well. Now, I'm not saying that some people didn't get some benefit, but a lot didn't. So Freud's work, the analytical side, did not get pulled into the human potential movement or personal development movement. What happened with him was that he kind of remained as part of the traditional medical structure, and Carl Jung, who also was, new and was friendly and corresponded back and forth with Freud, he looked at it in a different way. In fact, I would have to say, and looking at all the things that were done, that I probably would say that Jung did the most comprehensive work of any of those writers, researchers, and clinicians that were working in the early 1900s. He actually developed a lot of techniques. He had a better understanding. He looked at the world as a whole. He looked at the history of mankind as a whole, and drew from that a lot of information that became highly practical in people making change. He was one of the first, if not the first, to utilize GSR, which is a type of biofeedback, which we'll talk about in a minute. He utilized that to measure your unconscious responses via the autonomic nervous system. And when we talk about biofeedback, I'll get into more detail. Bottom line is, if you are said to or told to think of a word, and that word is emotionally in your unconscious neutral, there's no response on the instrument that you would be using, which was an electronic monitoring instrument. But if it had attached to it a lot of emotional issues, you would get a large meter reading response on this equipment telling you that that word was connected to some type of material in your unconscious that was very disturbing to you. And so he kind of used that to narrow down the subject areas that were a problem to you. So that was one of the things he did. He developed techniques of helping you just mentally getting into areas where your problems were, and then making change, because he was big on making change. He recognized and wrote about something called the archetypes, that there's certain concepts that are common to mankind, and that we are influenced by those concepts. For example, motherhood is a concept that seems to be universal, no matter what your ethnic background, no matter what your physiological background or your geographical background. Everybody has a certain underlying feeling about and thinking about motherhood. So he came in and got into archetypes, and he explored a lot of that. He explored a lot of the what's called mythology, whether it really was a myth or not, of mankind. And he explored the Eastern thinking, the Western thinking, and so forth. So if you read any of his material, you will find that in my mind, that Jung was brilliant in his scope, because Freud, kind of narrowed down into pathology and the unconscious as it relates to pathology, whereas Jung was so much more broad. He wanted to know what made man in general tick, but not only that, how can we improve our lot? What can we do to become better? So you can see why some of his material would have been incorporated into this growth process, because he produced material that gave you not only understanding, but methodologies to move out of that. Now, another big individual that was part of this movement, or at least his material was another psychiatrist. He was an MD psychiatrist by the name of Dr. Wilhelm Reich, and he was, in my mind, also way ahead of his time. He developed so much information about, again, how disturbances affect you, but he was big in understanding what it did to you physically. In other words, he developed a concept and a type of therapy called organ therapy, and he wrote several books, and one of his books, called Character Analysis, was a standard textbook of psychiatry for many years. But he understood the mind-body relationship better than any of them, as far as I can see. And I have studied his material extensively also. And he talked about body energies. He talked about a lot of things that eventually got him into trouble with the establishment, which as always happens. Fortunately, Jung was in an environment in Switzerland that he had pretty much intellectual freedom. But Wilhelm Reich, ultimately, he left Europe. The war was coming. He ended up ultimately settling in the United States and up in the New England area, actually near New Hampshire. He was a researcher. He was a thinker. He was an innovator. And as he developed this therapy system, as I say, that at the time it was called organ therapy, and the word organ was one that I think he created, which meant organic energy. And he realized that there was energy in the body, and that the movement or blockage of energy could be a problem. Now, it's kind of, in a sense, a modern explanation of Chinese medicine, which also talks about channels or meridians or pathways that go through the body and move energy through the body and keep everything working right, and that blockages of that energy lead to health problems. Well, he was aware of that, and so he called it armoring. And the theory was that if you have unconscious emotional blocks, that it blocks the energy flow, and that you tighten or develop chronic tightness in bands of muscles around the body. And there were 7 different zones or bands of muscles. And so he came up with the idea that, contrary to what Freud was saying, you just need to talk and uncover the issue and everything will be great. It wasn't working. So he said, you're never going to get rid of a problem that has solidified itself in the structure of the body. And so what you're going to have to do is to break that armor or those bands of constriction so that the energy can move freely through your body and so that you can regain your function and health. And so I discovered that many years ago when I went to a program in New York. I originally, even though I'm in the holistic health field in general, and in Florida I'm licensed under Oriental Medicine. I also have been licensed in naturopathic medicine and have studied naturopathic medicine. I've studied regular medicine. I had to study a lot of pharmacology, and the whole realm. I think I probably have as well a rounded education, because I've studied Tibetan medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, which is an offshoot of ancient Hindu yoga medicine, which I've also studied, and Chinese medicine, which is an offshoot, and Tibetan. Those are all offshoots of ancient Hindu yoga medicine. And our modern medical system had its roots back in that also. So pretty much the medicine of the world came out of the East, and when I say the East, in the area of India, and the Vedic influences from that area. So at any rate, he got into this energy thing and how it affects you physically. And so he said if the energy were cut off long enough, it could lead to cancer. So he was one of the early people establishing a mind-body connection or emotional-body connection with pathology, and in particular cancer. And he wrote a book called The Cancer Biopathy. That was one of the many books he wrote. Anyhow, he delved into areas that we don't even have time to talk about. Gave us some understanding of this energy concept, because none of the other psychiatrists were heavy into this energy thing like he was. And that was, of course, ultimately his downfall. As he got in this country and studied the whole subject more, he actually started referring to himself as a biophysicist as opposed to a psychiatrist, because now he was looking at the whole mind-body and energies and how energies influence us, and even weather and so forth. So, I mean, the scope of his awareness and work, in a sense, was very much like Jung, but he took it in some of the different directions that Jung didn't get into. And so a lot of the things he was aware of and wrote about and actually worked was incorporated into something that later was called Gestalt therapy. And we're not going to get to talk too much about it, but the Gestalt part of it was incorporated into these growth centers. Now, when we say Gestalt, that's from a German word, and it doesn't have a really good English equivalent, but Gestalt means configuration. And what happens is that whatever is the greatest stressor in your system tends to try to get your attention for resolution. So if you have hunger, for example, that hunger comes to the foreground and keeps trying to get your attention. Your stomach keeps saying, I'm hungry, I want food, I want food. And even though you push it aside, it keeps coming back. And so it keeps working to get your attention. Now, everything else in your life tends to move into the background. And so here's the configuration thing. Here's a stressor working for your attention, and all the rest of the world is back in the background. it was an interesting concept, and there was a type of psychology that had to do with the way the brain organizes things. And that's where the Gestalt psychology came from. But it was taken a step further when Reich realized how what was going on in the psyche is actually affecting you physically as well as emotionally. And so another doctor by the name of Fritz Perls came along, and he took basically the principles of Gestalt psychology and the work of Wilhelm Reich and combined it together into a type of therapy and personal growth concept. And Gestalt became a part of these centers, an understanding of it and an application of it. So they dealt a lot with dreams, they dealt a lot with methodologies that can help you not only tune into the problem, but resolve it and lay it to rest. And that's what Reich was trying to do. And sometimes he would literally physically push on the muscles to provoke them to get relaxed. And of course, he started with breathing, because breathing is one of the ways we ingest energy. That goes all the way back to Chinese medicine, that the breathing brings in a certain type of energy into the system that's very important. And so in Gestalt therapy, you start out by doing that, breathing, learning how to open up the throat and breathe, because when you have emotional armoring, you constrict the throat and you constrict the chest. So you don't breathe as well, and you don't breathe as well through your throat. And of course it affects your speech, so it can change the way you speak if you have a lot of constriction in the throat. It can constrict the way you talk because there's a band around the jaw and a band around the eyes and so forth. So these bands of armoring, different people, it's settled in different one or groups of those. And so what he would do is he would recognize where they were, and he would utilize the type of therapy he did to break those. But he didn't stop there. He went on and found that like cancer can be a problem, and so he developed a type of therapy where you help the person re-energize the body, and that's what got him in trouble. You know, the cancer industry has been around for a long time. They went way, way back when they realized there was a lot of money to be made when there started to be an increase in the cases of cancer, which unfortunately a big part of it was the deficiency diseases because the soil was depleted and people were eating non-nutritious food, or what we would call nutrient-poor food. And so anyhow, he did a lot of work with cancer, and the cancer industry did not want anybody coming in and doing things different than what they were doing, which was surgery, chemotherapy, and radiation, which is what it had settled into. And so they needed to get rid of him, which they did. They ended up getting him, getting the FDA in to attack his research facility, to confiscate all of his records and burn them, to take off his equipment and destroy it. And so it's a big, long story. In fact, Ralph Nader, who looked into this, said it was one of the most tragic things and outlandish things that has been done to someone. And this occurred in the 1950s, so it's not like it was way back in what we might call a less informed period of time. But anyhow, they had to get rid of him because what he was doing was counter to what they were making big money on, and they had to get rid of him, and they did. But his material, however, survived. He had trained a lot of other psychiatrists. There was one in New York by the name of Ellsworth Baker, who was a psychiatrist that continued to use the term organ therapy. There was a book written about it by a man by the name of Orson Bean, who was an entertainer, actor, and he had gone to traditional Freudian psychoanalysis for years and spent thousands of dollars, and he still had a lot of problems. It didn't help him very much. In fact, he said it didn't help him any. And he heard about this work. He ended up going to Ellsworth Baker, and he got well in a short period of time, because they approached it from the energy and this constriction or blockage or armoring thing. And in short order, he had a resolution of his problems and did very well. So he wrote a book about it called Me and the Organ. And Ellsworth Baker, the therapist he went to, wrote a book called Man in the Trap, which discussed the principles of why we have all these problems. And another doctor who trained with Wilhelm Reich was Alexander Lowen, and so he thought that orgone was kind of a nebulous term, so he revised and called it bioenergetics. So there are a lot of books out about bioenergetics by Alexander Lowen and now a lot of other people. So again, we won't go into all the details, but the whole Gestalt thing, as Fritz Perls put it together, became one of the main players in these growth centers, a way of uncovering and getting rid of a lot of your constrictions or restrictions that would hold you back. Another big individual back in that time who came strictly from the physiological side was Ida Rolf, and something referred to as Rolfing. She called it structural integration, but what she would do, she would break the blocks. Again, getting back to Reich's ideas. The body gets these chronic tensions which actually distort your structure. It affects the way you walk, the way you stand, the way you perform, and creates all kinds of problems. So she developed, she was a physical therapist to begin with, so she realized that when you broke certain tensions in the body, the people had a tremendous emotional release. And she was in essence coming from the other end, verifying what Wilhelm Reich had discovered. And so it developed into a whole type of special physical therapy called, as I say, nickname for her, Rolfing. She preferred the term structural integration, is how you integrate the structure back into the psyche, basically. And it has worked very well. So that, or offshoots of that, developed and became a part of these centers. So maybe you're starting to get the idea that it's an eclectic type of an approach, that you look for all the information out there from research and clinical practice that seems to be something people can learn and can apply to themselves. And so basically, you're not making them dependent on the center. The center acts as an educational channel to give you the information so you can make the improvements in your life. So instead of having to go to therapists for everything, you're able to make your own changes. You have to decide where it is you want to go. And so you can go back to Napoleon Hill's work, where you can decide, well, do I want to become financially well off? Do I want to become emotionally well off? You know, what do I want to do? And success, as we talk about, it has the best definition that was actually developed by Earl Nightingale. We don't even have time to talk about Earl Nightingale, but some of his material was very important also. He came from a poor background, same thing, realized one day that you didn't have to be poor to be happy, you could be rich and happy. And so he became a very influential figure for many years. One of his best recordings, and you can still find it online if you look under Earl Nightingale, you will find that it was called The Strangest Secret. And the strangest secret is, why is it that all these people in this country start out, and by the time they retire, only a handful of them are independently wealthy or comfortable. The bulk of the people are dependent on pensions and Social Security, or they couldn't survive. And some don't. And so he said, you know, the strangest secret is why some people, starting from nothing, can retire very comfortable and do anything they want to do, and which is a very small percentage, and the rest of the people have varying degrees of failure by the time they retire. And so he said, why is this? And so he laid out certain principles in this, it was like a mini essay. It was called The Strangest Secret. He had the perfect voice. He got it. He was a radio DJ back in that day, not for music, but for information. He became extremely successful, but he was influenced by Napoleon Hill's material. And he went on to be one of the greatest influencers of people in this country. At one time, he had radio programs being syndicated all over the country, and he had these little bits that radio stations would put in when they had a minute or two or three slot or something. They subscribed to his little tidbits that they would put out. And so he was a good person to understand. And some of the things that he did got incorporated into some of these growth centers. So I'm showing you the different directions of things that came along. Now there's one other important figure that many people have not heard of, or some people have heard but don't really know anything about, and that was Jose Silva, who was a poor Mexican fellow. He ended up, his father was killed when he was a little boy. He had two younger brother and sister, and at 5 and 6 years old, he was out figuring out a way to make some money to feed the family. And eventually got out of Mexico into Laredo, Texas area, and got married. He taught himself electronics and did very well at it, and did a lot of other things, but he became interested in learning when he had several children, and he wanted to make sure that they did well in school and that they were actualized, meaning they were capable of doing whatever they wanted to do. And so out of that, he learned something about if the mind is in a certain state, what it can do as far as learning and as far as unleashing capabilities. And he called it alpha mind training, or some people called it the Silva mind control system, you learning to control your own mind. It's continued on. He's now expired, but a couple of his children are still carrying it on, and the programs are good. They're keeping up with the research of what's being known. His material was not just a fad. He actually got doctors involved that became excited about what he was doing. It actually was researched in universities, and so they proved that he was in fact getting the mind in the alpha state. Now we haven't talked too much about the brain frequencies, but he got the mind in the alpha state. And so a lot of that, the understanding of different brain frequency patterns and how they affect you, that became also a big part of this movement. So I hope I'm beginning to pique your interest a little bit. I'm wanting you to think, wow, maybe there is something to it, and there is, and there's a lot more now. And I know we're not going to be able to cover all of it, but I'm just going to give you an overview, because we're not going to drag this out into another session. I want you to get the feel of it and the concept of it all in one session. So I, as I say, became interested in, and by the time of the late 60s, early 70s, I had learned enough about all of this and had read pretty much everything that was out there at the time, and biofeedback was starting to grow, and the research on it. So it ended up that I started doing some programs for people in the sales field, basically. In fact, it was a quirk that had happened because I had been studying it, and I met some people. One was a real estate broker who had a huge number of branches all over the state of Ohio, and he wanted something that would help his people unleash their capabilities and succeed, better for them, better for him. And I ended up doing a series of programs for him, and then eventually for a lot of other people. And I incorporated a lot of these things that were known. Now, I've mentioned biofeedback, and we need to bring that up because that became one of the big features. And when I say biofeedback, it's just exactly what the word says, feedback to you about your biological functioning. And so it was shortened to biofeedback. And it had its beginning in New York University, and there was a professor there by the name of Dr. Neil Miller, and he got the idea one time that we could probably learn how to control our autonomic functions. Now, autonomic functions have to do with the part of our nervous system that is called the autonomic system, which consists of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves. These are groups of nerves that either speed things up or slow things down. We won't get into the technical details of it, but bottom line is, if things happen to you, these come into play to either prepare you, and the old typical term, fight and flight response. If something threatens you, you're triggered into a state whereby you either are going to stand there and fight it out or you're going to get away as fast as possible. That's called the fight and flight response. That's all triggered automatically by sensory input coming into you that there's a threat, and your brain reacting immediately via the autonomic system to prepare you to do whichever you're going to do. It changes the way the blood is flowing in the body, it changes your heart rate, it changes your breathing pattern, changes your metabolism, it changes everything to be able to deal with that for the moment. Once it's over, then the opposite occurs. Everything calms back down, the blood flow changes a different direction again, your digestion turned back on, or if it was off, and it would be if the sympathetic were triggered. And so all these things are done automatically. And so medicine taught in medical schools that that was totally out of your control. There was nothing you could do about it. But for some reason, Neil Miller got this idea, I think we could probably learn how to train our autonomic nervous system to do what we wanted. In other words, if it always is overreacting and we're getting highly stressed and are affecting our physical health, could we learn then to settle back down and be calm and calm down and balance the autonomic nervous system? And so he looked at ways to do it, and he thought, well, if we had instrumentation that we could hook somebody up to and monitor where they are, they could then learn how to change by the feedback coming from the instrument. Were we accomplishing it or were we not? And that's how the term biofeedback was coined. But the problem was, in medical school and all of the medical sciences, it was being taught that we have no conscious control over the autonomic system. And so he says, I kind of doubt that. I think we could. So he looked for some graduate students who were willing to participate, starting out with lab animals, to train them to alter their autonomic function at will. Well, he couldn't find any students because they all knew that you can't do that, because medicine's already said, no, you have no control. If whatever it's going to do, it's going to do, and that's it. But, that was one of our stages of ignorance. And so he finally found some students who would do it, and lo and behold, they found out they could train rats to at will alter their autonomic system by rewards, and the reward could come either by feeding them, or it could come by a noise, a light, a pleasant sound, or whatever, but some kind of feedback that let them know when they were doing it. And so it developed then to humans then, and I went to a mammoth convention in New York City way back then, which would have been late 60s, early 70s, somewhere in there, and it was a national, actually international occurrence related to biofeedback. That was the whole subject. And I met a doctor researcher from Germany by the name of Wolfgang Luther, who had developed something called autogenic training, which was doing the same thing. He had developed a way to do it. There were people from the meditative areas, like transcendental meditation, who trained you how to calm your system down. Again, affecting the autonomic system. There were people from research of instruments to give you feedback, either of the brain, which would be electroencephalographic feedback, skin temperature, GSR that we talked about with Carl Jung, other methods of getting feedback. There was electromyograph for muscle tensions, and so forth. There was all these different ways that you could get information visibly and audibly to a person that he was making change. And so there was, I think, 5,000 attendees to this big conference on biofeedback. And I got to meet a lot of them. Dr. Herbert Benson from Harvard, who still is in the whole field of understanding how we can train and retrain ourselves. He wrote a book called The Relaxation Response, which was his original book. Now there's other books out. He's continued to research it for years, and now you won't believe some of the stuff that he's into, that he's learned that you can do. For example, change cellular function, change DNA. I mean, there's all kinds of things you can do that before the medical paradigm says you can't do this. Anyhow, they proved that you could do all that. So all of these principles, the relaxation and all of that, became connected with this movement. So everything was really moving along well, except, as I say, they kind of made it into a fad, and people began to lose interest, and pretty soon it all faded away as far as centers. The only one that remained, and as far as I know is still in operation, is Esalen Institute in California, which was probably the largest one. Oasis folded up, the others in New York, and the various cities, they just kind of phased out, and people kind of got away from it. But the interesting thing is that I have the feeling now that things are starting to change, and a lot of new technology has come along. We don't have time to even talk about all of it, but there's a lot has been learned about sound and sound frequencies. A lot has been learned about extracranial stimulation or electrical stimulation, which means you can do something called entrainment of the brain. The brain will entrain to certain frequencies. Now, there's good and bad sides to that, and we don't have time to even discuss all that, but the entrainment means you can use certain sounds to put you in a certain state of mind, which you can learn better, you can remember better, you can heal yourself better. There's all kinds of things that can be done with it just because we now understand more about what sound could do. Back in those early days, other than playing some music, they didn't really know. I mean, they knew about brainwave frequencies and so forth, but they didn't know all the intricate details about very key frequencies that are entrainment frequencies and all of that, and how that can be utilized to help you improve yourself. So that was one of the things that came along. And so there's different ways of applying that, whether you're sitting in a chair that has built-in sound transducers and music played along with embedded sounds that affect you. That's one of the things that can be done with it, just listening to it with earphones. Binaural beats, that means you play one frequency in one ear and one in the other. The Monroe Institute out of Virginia got big into that, and how that can create frequencies in your brain that help you develop. The neurophone that was developed by Pat Flanagan that allows you to hear directly in the brain by bypassing the ears, which means someone who's deaf can use it, but yet you never heard it get out there and really promote it. In fact, when he first developed the device, the government immediately had it classified as a security threat, and he couldn't get his patent and couldn't get the unit out for a long time. And finally, he was able to get it released. So they knew something about mind control and things they didn't want people to know at the time. Now it kind of got lost. I have, I think, 2 different units that are very good. It was called the neurophone, and you put electrodes on the forehead, and even if you cannot hear, you're totally deaf, when you play music and speech through this, you hear it inside your brain, but not through your ears. And what he found that is, if you worked with that and used it a while, it started to activate other capabilities in the brain that have been dormant. So a tremendous tool, but you never hear anything about it. Echophone was another instrument that was developed. It uses a combination of earphones and electrodes that are transducers that it was developed so you can hear the complete range of sounds from dolphins, and so they called it an echophone. I have one of those. Those work extremely well to get information into your mind and brain. And the light sound machines, which combine with certain frequencies of flashing lights and of different colors, and combining it with sounds and or music, and you can use that to put the mind into relaxed state and your body also, and different states to learn better, faster, develop creativity. I mean, it goes on and on and on. Subliminal recordings came along where they embedded information into the music, and it was kind of below your hearing, your normal hearing as you know of it, but yet it would pick up in the brain and people could make changes with it. They came along now with computerized things like EEGs, which were part of the feedback from biofeedback, but now they got very specialized with all kinds of things they can do with it. And so the EEG feedback can be in time, which means immediately as the brain is shifting, you can see it on the screen. Not only can you make changes, but a lady by the name of Charlotte Ayers, who is unfortunately now expired, developed a method of bringing people out of comas and all kinds of things using encephalographic brainwave and light, flashing lights and sound. Then, as I say, the electrocranial stimulation, Bob Beck developed an instrument you can put on the mastoid process behind the ears, and it improves brain function and capability, helps you to relax, to sleep. In fact, the Russians developed a machine called the Somatron, which would actually, people who had insomnia problems, would help them to sleep. And he developed a brain tumor to develop all kinds of things. Beck did. Another researcher out of England by the name of C. Maxwell Wade and a lady by the name of Alice Wise, who went and studied with him for years, studied people who can get into deep relaxed states like meditators and so forth, and he called it the awakened mind, and he developed a special instrument called the mind mirror. Now people are sometimes calling it brain mirror, but it reflects all the frequencies that are present at one time, and a certain pattern of frequencies indicate that your mind is in a certain state. So that's available, and they had used that a little bit, but it didn't get much into the growth centers at the time. But now would be really big to utilize that technology. And heart rate variability has come along, which measures microarrhythmias of the heart and heart coherence and incoherence in beating. A big institution out of California called the Institute for Heart and Math done tremendous research in that, showing you can even influence DNA by changing the autonomic system balance and how you can balance it, and you can see it on the computer screen and train yourself to be calm in the most stressful situations. And so there's a lot being done with that. A special type of subliminal developed by Eldon Taylor out of the Northwest called Inner Talk, where you put reverse speech in one ear and normal speech in the other, because one half the brain and works different than the other half. And that was a lot of work done by Robert Ornstein, who back during that early period of time was doing a lot of work on hemispheric lateralization and a lot of the capabilities that we had. And he wrote a book called The Psychology of Consciousness. A lot of Ornstein's material is available, and I think some of his stuff is on my website. I'm sure it is, as far as books that I recommend. And all of these things have now become available. So I've been getting ready to bring this all together, because now they're finding out. I'll throw this in real fast. Our time has expired here. Some of the new things that were discovered that medicine said is impossible. One is you can't grow more neurons. By the time you're 18 or 19, it's all done. From then on, it's downhill. Now the new research shows something called neurogenesis, meaning you can continue to grow neurons as much as you stimulate for it. Brain plasticity, how the brain can totally reorganize itself as you need it. The functions of different regions of the brain, there's been more and more discoveries about that. Neural networks, how neurons join together to form networks. The work of Candace Pert, which I've mentioned before, how consciousness is stored through the whole body, and the neuropeptides, how information is carried back and forth throughout your body. And of course, psychoneuroendocrinoimmunology, which is the relationship of the mind-brain with the immune system, the endocrine system, and your neurology period. In other words, the whole mind-body package. And of course, energy psychologists come along, which we don't really have time to talk about, other than there's ways from Roger Callahan and his thought field therapy and Gary Craig and his emotional freedom technique, that tapping on certain acupoints on the energy meridians can cause you to help eliminate problems and can improve your health, and it's things you can do yourself. And so there is the makings of a new human potential movement. I have plans to open a center where we can bring all this together and incorporate it, and people can begin to actually take themselves to wherever they want to go, health-wise, emotional-wise, and accomplishment-wise. So I guess we've come to the end. I did not mention too much, only a little bit, but some of the work of Bruce Lipton, and it's called The Biology of Belief. You need to get into his material, and Heart Math, their material. And if you can get onto that from my website, his books are on my website, mindyourhealthcast.com. And I want to get a center open where we can bring all this technology together, because there's even other things that are even way beyond this I didn't even have time to bring in. But I wanted to whet your interest. I wanted you to know that there is always things going on, and that our ability to do whatever we want and however we want is there. We have to become aware of it, and if we want, tap into it. And that's what we want to do, is have a center where you can come in and utilize all those tools, find out where you are, and determine where you want to go. And here are all the tools that can get you there, help you get there. It was nice being with you again. We want you to go back to our website, mindyourhealthcast.com, go through all the pages. There's a lot of interesting information. We're always adding things to it. And we would like you, of course, you can also, there's a connection between our website and the other website I have called Alternative Health and Prevention, which has to do with my clinic side. And we're welcoming any of your comments. We have a forum page you can put information on, ask questions, challenge, whatever you want to do. And if you do go on, be sure and register, because then we will send you emails, not to harass you to sell you something, but to let you know what broadcasts that are coming up new every week, and any other information that might be, because we do lectures in clinic, and I've considered maybe we can put those on our mailing when we're letting know about the broadcast, about a lecture coming up, that are free at the office. Other than that, I want you to have a good day and be healthy, and I look forward to being with you again next week.